All right, let's jump into one of the most foundational stories in the entire Bible, Genesis chapters 12 through 19. We're going to explore how God kicks off this world-changing plan to rescue and bless all of humanity, and he does it all through one man, Abraham, and the promised offspring that would eventually come from his family line.
So here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start at the very beginning, figuring out why a rescue plan was even necessary. Then we'll look at the specific promise God makes to Abraham, how a right relationship with God actually works, and how God formalizes that promise. But most importantly, we're going to see what all of this tells us about God's character and the Savior he promised was coming.
So first things first, let's set the stage. You see, God's call to Abraham doesn't just come out of the blue. It's actually a direct answer to a huge worldwide problem that started way back in the first few chapters of Genesis.
And that leads to the big question, why Abraham? To get the answer, we have to rewind a little bit to the time before Abraham. At this point in the story, there's no nation of Israel, nothing like that. But God is already laying the groundwork for his global plan of blessing.
The first few chapters of Genesis show this really clear and kind of sad pattern. Humanity just keeps choosing its own way, doing its own thing, and that creates this deep separation from God. But here's the amazing part. Even with all that rebellion, God's first response is grace. He immediately promises that a future offspring would come, one who would finally crush the enemy and fix this broken relationship for good.
And you can see it right here in these verses. Even in those really early dark days, some people started to believe in that promise. They didn't have much to go on, just a simple word from God. But by calling on his name, they were showing faith, and that simple faith started to mend that broken fellowship.
Okay, so that brings us to a huge turning point. God's plan takes this massive step forward when he calls one specific man, a guy named Abram, to be the channel for his blessing to the entire world.
I mean, just let that command sink in for a second. God tells Abram to leave everything he knows, his home, his security, his family, his whole culture, and just go. And where is he going? To a land that God will show him. That is a radical call to step out in faith, based on nothing more than a promise from God.
And this wasn't just some casual, hey, I hope this works out kind of promise. No, this was a three-part covenant promise that would literally shape the rest of the Bible. And look at the progression here. It starts with one man, Abram. It grows to a great nation. And the end game? A blessing for all peoples on earth. It's a global plan from the very beginning.
So as Abraham starts on this journey, God teaches him the most fundamental lesson about how their relationship works. And honestly, it's a lesson that completely flips our normal human logic upside down.
You see, Abraham comes to understand a really critical thing about God's character. He is sovereign. And what does that mean? Well, basically it means God is completely self-sufficient. He doesn't need Abraham or anyone else to get his plans done. And that is a crucial piece of the puzzle for what comes next. This quote right here from Joshua just nails the point. So, why did God choose Abraham? Was he some super righteous guy who was already seeking God? Not even close. The Bible is clear. He came from a family of idol worshippers. God graciously chose him, not because of anything Abraham did, but simply because of God's own merciful plan.
And then God gives Abraham a promise that, let's be honest, is completely impossible from a human perspective. He's an old man, his wife Sarah is way past childbearing age. So by taking him outside and telling him to count the stars, God is giving him this incredible visual aid, showing him, look, this promise is going to be fulfilled by my power, not by your ability.
And this all leads to one of the most important verses in the entire Bible. Abraham's righteousness, his right standing before God, it didn't come from his obedience or his good deeds. It was credited to him. It was given to him the very moment he simply believed God's impossible promise. It was a gift received purely through faith.
Okay, so after Abraham shows this faith, God takes another step to make their relationship official. He makes a binding agreement, what the Bible calls a covenant, and he gives it a physical sign so that the promise would never, ever be forgotten.
Now, this isn't the first time God has done something like this. You can see in the table, just like he gave Noah the rainbow as a sign of his promise, he gives Abraham the sign of circumcision. It was an outward mark that identified someone as belonging to this family of promise.
And to really seal the deal on this covenant, God even changes Abram's name. Abram meant something like exalted father, but his new name, Abraham, means father of a multitude. So his very identity, his name, was now completely wrapped up in the global scope of God's promise.
Now, this is where the story gets really fascinating. As the promise starts to unfold, a mysterious visitor shows up who gives us a much clearer picture of who this promised offspring from the beginning of Genesis is ultimately going to be.
So when Abraham's servant Hagar runs away into the desert, she's met by this figure called the angel of the Lord. But as we look at the details of what happens, it becomes pretty clear this is no ordinary angel.
Let's look at the clues here, like we're detectives. First, he just looks like a man. But then, he speaks with divine authority. He says, "I will multiply your descendants," something only God can promise to do. And look at Hagar's reaction. She doesn't say, "Oh, thank you, nice angel." She says, "You are the God who sees me." She knew who she was talking to.
So what's the big takeaway here? Well, the people back then already knew about the promise of a coming human savior, the seed of the woman. But now they see God himself showing up in human form. It's this profound revelation, a huge hint pointing forward to the reality that the promised rescuer would be both fully God and fully man.
Okay, so finally, this whole section of Genesis wraps up with the dramatic story of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this event, it reveals two critical aspects of God's character held in this perfect, beautiful balance: his justice and his mercy.
On one hand, you have judgment. The Bible is very clear that the sin of these cities was great, and God, as the just judge of all the earth, deals with it. But on the other hand, in the middle of that judgment, you see this incredible mercy. He patiently listens to Abraham pleading for the city, and then he physically leads Lot's family out to safety.
And it all comes down to this one question. It was first asked when Sarah literally laughed at the idea of having a baby in her old age. But it applies to everything we've talked about: the impossible promise of descendants, the rescue of Lot, and the entire plan to bless the world. The story of Abraham is the definitive answer, showing us that what is totally impossible for humans is absolutely possible for the God who always keeps his promises.